Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Gluu, and today is episode 93, Token-Based Access Control, Is It the Future? And today our guests are Atul Tulshi Bagwale, CTO of Signal, and Jerry Gable, VP of Product and Standards at Strata Identity. Welcome, guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Hey, everyone.
A little bit of housekeeping before we dive into the topic. If you want to support the live stream, a good way to do that is to follow it on LinkedIn. There's a LinkedIn company page for Identerati Office Hours. So we're going to digress from the normal format a little bit because this is the first time we have two return guests to Identerati Office Hours. So normally we start with introductions, but I'm going to direct you guys to episodes 4, where Jerry was one of the first guests, and episode 44 with Atul. Those episodes are both linked on the live streams, so we can you can just go to their original introductions. We're going to dive right into the topic today. And I guess maybe let me start out by giving some context here. And the discussion is on token-based access control, which is one of my new theories about maybe how we can look at access. And I wanted to define, before we actually dive into that, what is a token and what is token-based access control. So I define token pretty widely. It could be an access token, an identity assertion like an ID token, a federation token like a software statement, or an attestation from an authenticator like a FIDO attestation, or a platform attestation. Google's Integrity API, where, for example, will give you an attestation if the device, what type of device it is. And I guess you could also throw in there non-JWTs. My thinking is very JWT oriented, but even like a SAML assertion is assigned, XML, or even X509 or X509 certificate could be a type of token. So I'm defining token pretty broadly. And token-based access control is basically, given this context and bundle of tokens, is this action allowed on this resource? And I think that that's a good way to look at it. And that and in the past, our access control models were maybe too person centric. So let's pause there. And let's go in alphabetical order. Atul, I guess 2 questions in one is: do you agree with my sort of expansive view of the definition of tokens? And what are your thoughts on token-based access control?
Yeah, I think I agree with your general sort of definition of tokens, that they're signed objects. They don't necessarily have to be JWTs. Could be something else, like SAML tokens, for example. But something that you can rely on for sort of making a decision. A piece of data that you can rely on for making a decision is kind of what I would think of a token as. And in that sense, I think token-based access control is necessarily a component of any access control system, because even if you're talking about RBAC or ABAC, or you're going to be using tokens to initiate maybe the session, or even to understand the scope of what the user may be wanting to do in that session. And so I think it is definitely a part of everything that we do today. And I don't think, unlike federated identity or, single sign-on, where if you're doing federated identity, you're not doing like password-based authentication, right? You're kind of relying on somebody else, right? Authorization or access control is not exclusive, right? You can have many things going on at the same time. And so, yes, I think token-based access control is a part of everything that we do.
I'm just going to pause it there, Jerry. You've been at Gartner or Burton Group. You've been at Axiomatics for a year, so I look to you as one of the most knowledgeable people about access control systems. What do you think of token-based access control?
Yeah, well, I acknowledge that it could be a number of different types of tokens, if you will, like you and Atul said. although I also think of this mostly from the JSON Web Token perspective. But one thing that struck me in reading your article was that you posed this as something new. And as Atul said, we've been doing this for a while. Tokens have been part of OAuth and OpenID Connect and other systems for a long time. So I don't think it's something new, but it's been used in combination with other technologies. Depending on which layer in the stack that you're doing this access control. Tokens are used in some places and other methods are used elsewhere. So I think I don't think it's something new, but it should be incorporated into the overall authorization implementation or design, for your particular environment.
Yeah, so I respond to that. It's interesting because I completely agree that it's not new. In fact, I took some comfort in the idea that a number of comments were, well, we're already doing this. Next Tuesday, I'm going to interview a guy from iShare, and they have a B2B exchange in Europe where they use tokens really to for logistics and other like cross-border and collaborative efforts. And he said, no, we've been doing this for years. Peter Cohn from Microsoft he works for the Eclipse decentralized some protocols, something I'd never actually heard of. And he said, we've been doing this. So I kind of agree that I actually took comfort in the idea that this has really been the case. We really have been doing this. But at the same time, I would push back and say that when you look at access control models, they fundamentally, I think, are stuck on the idea that is this person allowed to do this thing, this action on this resource? And they really seem to be stuck on the idea that it's about a single entity, either a person or a workload. And that I just feel like this way of looking at it is that it needs to change. I know, Atul, any thoughts, follow-up thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, at any point you want to make an access decision, and that could be at the time of login, or it could be at the time you're actually doing the access. You have a choice, right? You can rely on some data that you have with you, or you can ask something else, right? So if you think about RBAC, what you're saying is, I have this access request. I'm going to check my database or something to see whether the roles match or something, and does this person, the user that is represented in some manner to me, do they have access to the resource they're asking, right? Whereas what you're trying to do in a token-based access control is just embodying all that into a token. So the entity making the decision doesn't have to go anywhere to look for that data. It's all there in the token, right? And so at the very fine-grained level, I think it actually makes things more efficient. And so yeah, I like it from that point of view.
And Jerry, just to put a sort of distinction on this, it might be more than one token, right? It could be, it could be that you have an access, like when you go through an OpenID Connect flow, the application actually gets an access token and an ID token, and potentially a user info token. And as I mentioned, might have some other tokens. So it's not just one token, it's multiple tokens. And so I don't know, any thoughts on what I'm proposing in token-based access control is that it's not a token, but a whole bundle of tokens, a collection of tokens that we're going to use in order to make our decision.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're pointing out, though, as well, is that each of those types have their own purpose and intent. And so we have to be wary of misusing like an ID token for access, for example. It's not meant for that, although I'm sure that happens out in the wild. So I think maybe part of what you're doing here is raising the visibility of these different token types, and also emphasizing, where are they appropriately used, and what should you avoid? What are some good practices around token issuance, use and management, refresh rates, and so on.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jerry, because I think that you have different tokens at different levels, right? And you're not only doing token-based access control, right? Because what you're doing is, when you get an external API call, like any application today is kind of based on microservices and all that, and you have external APIs published by that by that sort of collection of microservices, which kind of typically represents your application backend. And at the time you're getting the external call, you're going to do a whole lot of checks about whether that access should be allowed or not, and that could be based on whatever access control mechanism you favor, which is could be RBAC or ABAC or ReBAC or whatever it is. But then you're going to mint a token so that you can then pass that decision down to all your other microservices, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, is kind of the transaction token standard that we are working on. And so you're right that what comes in as an identity token should not be used for downstream authorization decisions. That's a totally different type of token.
I want to push back on that a little bit. I think that's, in first party situations, I think it's okay to pass the tokens. People pass SAML assertions all the time, right? Especially if it's a first party service. So if I have a mobile application that's a first party mobile application that's calling its own internal APIs, what's wrong with it passing an ID token and saying, I have authenticated and obtained an ID token, and here is both the access token that I obtained to call your API, and here's a proof of the identity of the person that I'm acting on behalf. Isn't it really common practice to? We all know about access tokens being passed downstream, but what's the issue with sending an ID token downstream?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. When I brought this up, Mike, I was referring to using an ID token for access. So
Yeah. For sure.
So in your case, sending them both downstream, totally fine with that.
Yeah, don't put the ID token in the authorization header, which is what an access token is. Like, don't use the wrong type of token for your request.
Right.
Of course. And
my
sorry,
concern with passing the ID token everywhere is that it can be replayed because it's long-lived. And if it is replayed, you're basically giving somebody the permission to impersonate the user. And that is not a good practice, right? So you may end up in a situation where a downstream service is either compromised or it's logging the token to its logs, and somebody discovers the token and now they have access to like that user's identity, right?
Could that be a policy failure though? Because if you say you must pass both an access token and an ID token, and the access token client ID must match the audience of the ID token. In that replace situation you're describing, you would need a fresher access token also. So I feel like
get that
policy.
right? I can do that, right? Because I can actually, take that ID token, act as the client, and then just become that user when I'm using that. So I can mint a new access token just because I'm now the client accessing that service, right? Like I'm the mobile app user, right?
If we refuse to pass the ID token, aren't we requiring that we stuff more information into the access token? And then at the same time, I had a very interesting conversation with Eli Nesterov from Spiral yesterday, and he reminded us, don't stuff too much information in those access tokens that actually pass through the infrastructure in the authorization headers, because weird things can happen when you print all the groups and you get all the group memberships and the guy's in like 500 groups, and now your token's huge. So passing the access token should be used for what it's designed for. But if what you're saying is true, and we have to take that information out of the ID token and stuff it into the access token, now that's not what the access token was designed for, and potentially it could create some weird instability in the infrastructure.
Right. And I think that's where I feel like there is innovation required, which is sort of why we came up with the idea of a transaction token. Because token bloat is a real thing, and it can hurt, it can definitely test the limits of what we can do today in computing, right? But what you can do is make that decision based on the ID token, based on what the user is trying to do. Make a decision about what this user should be doing right now, mint a transaction token that is super short-lived, and then pass that down. And that doesn't have to be fully loaded, right? It can have just the information required for the current transaction. And that is how we try to address this problem.
And presumably you're not passing it in the authorization header. You're passing it as a post, as a body parameter, or posting it somehow.
No, it's a different parameter different header called TXN token that's in the spec.
Okay.
So you can have a different authorization header. We decided not to use the authorization header because it can be used like in SPIFFE, for example, for conveying the authorization between the services. And you don't want to sort of trample with that. And that's why we have a different header for this.
Yeah, so I think you guys are pointing out a couple of issues here. One with token bloat, so this is like role explosion of the past. Now we're bloating up the token with all this information, whether it's roles, groups, or other claims. Some scenarios we've seen in use today is, we'll get a base access token from the IDP and then augment that based on rules for access to a particular resource. So you only add those additional claims to the token, based on what resource I'm trying to access right now. So it's more of a real-time situation. But the other thing this points out is, well, how do we control what goes in the token to begin with? It's all configured.
You have to get really good at enriching tokens.
Well, no,
right?
not that part. I'm talking about the initial issuance of token. I mean, how do we control that, right? It's just the configuration of that authorization server, right? In that system, and there's no policy behind that per se, right? It's just hard-coded configuration, which brings up the governance topic if we want to cover that at some point.
Actually, in a zero trust model, the IDP absolutely must be connected to the policy infrastructure, because the IDP needs to know, should I issue this scope, or should I issue this transaction, purpose to this particular token. So I think you 100% need to have policy in your IDP. The IDP is a critical security component. But Jerry, I think you brought up another interesting point, which is, what's the schema of this token? If the IDP is augmenting the schema of the token, there's an implicit sort of understanding that the developers on the other side are going to have to understand that schema and act accordingly. And one of my sort of propositions here is that we're putting too much cognitive load on developers to keep track of what's in those tokens and understand, like, what is a transaction token or what is an access token, and is it time to just sort of do you think we should unload some of that cognitive load from developers about understanding all this stuff?
I think we're talking at two different levels, right? So when I'm talking about transaction tokens, I'm not talking about IDP and external systems. I'm talking just about a VPC, right? Which is, you've already received the call, you've verified the user's identity, you've verified the scopes, you know exactly what the user is trying to do. You have to make a decision whether or not this action should be allowed. Now, once you've made that decision, you need to codify, this is what this particular call is about. And that is what is codified in that short-lived transaction token, and then that is passed down. So it's maybe at a different level. Maybe we're talking about it at a different level. And all that we're doing in the transaction token is basically taking the context of the call. It could be, path parameters, body parameters, or query parameters, and we are capturing some of that needs to be assured in the transaction token. And all that can be automated through software, like, the open source software that we're, I can talk about that later.
So we'll just taking transaction tokens, because I think this is a great example. And for the audience who's not familiar, transaction tokens is a new proposed type of token, not an access token, not an ID token. It's a token that has very specific information, like this token and authorizes the software to buy 100 shares of Microsoft at 50. Try explaining that in RBAC, right? but where do you see a tool, the policy decision being made in this? So you issue this transaction token. Who makes the policy decision in your thought? Is it the developers, or is it a PDP, or is it both?
Yeah, it's the PDP, because it's being made at the time the transaction token is being issued, right? So which is at your API gateway, or something that interfaces the initiator, which might be a mobile client or a user, to your application backend. So the transaction token service, the TTS as we call it, is the one that is doing the issuance. And we could use a normal PDP like an odds-n PDP or something to make a decision whether or not this should be allowed. But once you've decided, now you need to make sure that that decision cannot be sort of superseded by something downstream, and that's why you need this token to codify that decision essentially.
Yeah. So Jerry, I want to bring this back to an authorization, PDP discussion. One of the challenges here is that something like a transaction token, ID tokens, access tokens, they actually sort of implicitly imply multiple principles. And so there's not just a person, is this person authorized? It's, is this person using this piece of software authorized? So maybe there's a banking application that you can use on your, let's say, from the bank's website, but not from a third-party financial fintech website. So it's not just are you authorized to see your balance, but are you authorized to see your balance from this piece of software? So given that we have, multiple principles, is this another indication that our current model is not really working?
I don't know. That model has been in use also for decades, particularly in a lot of back office financial situations, that I can authorize a trade of an equity, and I may have limits myself as an individual trader, but those trades also have to be authorized within the context of my employer, right? My firm. So that dual principle model has been in effect. Are you suggesting that a token-based model can more easily represent that? Is that your premise here?
Yes, because when we, in a traditional setting, we're asking the developer to break apart these tokens and say, oh, well, this token implies this person, and this token implies this workload. And now I'm going to run a query on my PDP, is this person allowed? And now I'm going to run a query, is this workload allowed? We're asking the developer to do a lot. We're asking him to break apart those tokens, understand what those tokens mean, and then make the respective calls to the PDP correctly. And I just think that's a really big ask. And we not only have the person and workload, but we also have the organization itself.
That's right.
Maybe this client or this workload was registered by an organization that we trust or don't trust. So I just see that what the token-based access control allows us to model better is we just say, okay, developers, give us your tokens. We have the latest schema mapping from a tool about what these transaction tokens mean. And when we know our Strata server is going to give us these extra enriched augmented claims, and it lets the policymakers make policy about this and not push this off to the developers.
Okay, yeah, I see your point there, but it's in some ways a pay me now or pay me later situation, because we have seen also scenarios where the flow of tokens to the application and the developer, they may need to parse them themselves, as you described, Mike, or they could forward those tokens. Here we go again, sending the tokens downstream to a PDP to do that validation, so they can validate signatures, they can parse the contents and do all of that lifting, make the decision. And then, so it's a cleaner request that the developer has to issue. Here's my request, can this subject, do this action on this resource. Oh, by the way, here's some tokens for you to help validate that. Send it all to the PDP. Let that server do the lifting and then the evaluation, and then send the response back. So in that form, it's a lighter load on the developer. Does that sound reasonable?
Sounds like you're advocating for TBAC tool.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what AuthZen is, right? So, after a lot of discussion in the working group, which, I'm only peripherally a part of, that we arrived at this, principal action resource context model, right? So it's what I guess we can short form as PARC. And in that, you can basically include everything that you want to make decisions on. It could be the ID token that you get, or any information about the workloads, the resources that you're trying to access, and all those things. Pass that off to a PDP. The PDP does the heavy lifting. It tries to do everything. Make the right decision. Send back a decision. Now, the challenge is that your application is not a single monolithic piece of software, right? You need to pass that decision down to various microservices. And for that, you use the transaction token, right? So that you can basically just make sure that nothing downstream can change what they intend.
I hope you're right about that. Just let's remind the audience that transaction tokens is not a final draft. Although Janssen Auth Server, Glue's upstream open source, and Gluu Flex support it, this isn't really generally out there. So we're talking about the dream state, the ideal state, not the real state of the world today, because today, I'm sure adoption is going to be relatively small.
I mean, in that regard, so I may just, note that, Tokenetics, which is an open source implementation of transaction tokens for Kubernetes, has now been accepted in the CNCF sandbox. And so it is going to be available to everyone pretty soon.
And I think
I'll put a link to that in the notes for everyone who's interested.
Sorry, Mike, I think Atul, also brought up the AuthZen working group at OpenID Foundation. And one of the things that we're working on is a design patterns document to help developers recognize where these different models are best used or where they can be used together. So I think that's also something that the working group is hoping to publish as part of the standardization effort, because as you're pointing out here, there's lots of different approaches. How do they work together in harmony versus where are they best used for different kinds of scenarios.
I actually, the origin of TBAC was really the two meetings, AuthZen meetings I attended. And I looked at the API, which is fine, principal, action, resource, context. I think we have an agreement on that. There's no agreement on what should go in those. So we have a JSON with 4 claims, but there's zero agreement on actually what goes in that. And I would argue that TBAC is more of a discussion of what goes in that than how we send it. And the genesis of TBAC was when I briefly participated in AuthZen. The question is, what is the principle? And it was just like there was an ironclad belief that the principal was a person. You send the email address of the principal. It is always a person. And my take on it was, well, no, it's not a person. You have a bundle of tokens, and let the PDP, like you said, Jerry, figure out the entities there, what people and what workloads and what organizations do these tokens represent. So AuthZen, I don't think it really proposes any access control model in particular, and it's so high level as that I'm not actually sure it's useful until we can actually get agreement on what's in those requests. And TBAC is trying to say we need a new approach. And I agree that actually these access control models aren't mutually exclusive. So we have RBAC, which has governance structures that are in place, but where RBAC can't solve all of our rules. I would say that, in your Venn diagram view of this, that token-based access control can accommodate TBAC and RBAC and ABAC. But we need a bigger Venn diagram, because currently the Venn diagram of use cases we can cover with relationship-based, role-based, in particular, is really, really small and narrow given our current challenges. Atul?
Yeah, I mean, if I may, and like, I think that the, you know, let's look at where these things have their strengths and weaknesses, right? So I think when you have to make millisecond level decisions, right, you're not going to be able to go to some PDP and for every like transaction, like let's say I have a chain of like 6 or 7 microservices. At every microservices, I'm not going to be able to go back to the PDP and ask the question, right? I need something that I can make a decision on directly, and that's where I think
Unless you
TBAC
have an
becomes.
embedded PDP. Now, let me just stop you right there. According to zero trust principles, I think what you're saying is wrong. Actually, zero trust says every single part of the infrastructure absolutely needs to make its own authorizations, because it can't trust anything from before it. What you're saying is that your architecture of making network calls isn't going to work for that, which I agree, which is why we're arguing at Gluu that we need an embeddable PDP
Yeah.
like the Cedar link.
Yeah, and I think what I'm saying is not that each component needs to just trust everything. What I'm saying is it's very difficult for each component to go out to an external PDP to get a decision, right? What I'm saying is that is why you need a signed token that you can make a decision based on. And that is what zero trust is, that you're making a decision, you're making a trust decision for every access that you get based on something that is immutable, right? And that cannot be spoofed by the user. And I think TBAC is in my mind most useful in that scenario where you really don't have the luxury of going out to a PDP and making a decision.
Yeah.
You have to make that. And with that in mind, Mike, what you spoke about the generality of trying to make to trying to define the various fields in a token and stuff like that, I feel becomes very hard, because you cannot have a very general applicability and a very sort of agreed upon structure for everything, right? You have to make a choice that is this going to be very general, in which case you have to give the flexibility to whatever it is, is going to be put into the token, or you're going to say that, oh, this is only good for these type of use cases, and then I can agree on the specific fields, right? I don't think you can get both unless you want to bloat the token to like an infinite size, essentially.
Jerry, any thoughts on this, or should I move on to the next
Yeah,
question?
maybe we can move on. I think we've hit that one pretty good.
Okay, so I actually wanted to talk a little bit about governance. One of my feelings was that governance, like we didn't have SailPoint before RBAC. RBAC had to exist before we could make software like SailPoint to do governance on roles. But a new access control system does bring new challenges with regard to governance and how enterprises will manage these policies. Any thoughts on sort of where the governance stands, or how this could fit in, or what problems this would raise?
Yeah, I think there's some big questions to answer here. So, who has access to what? How do we determine the answer to that question when we're using just tokens for access? And this gets back to my question earlier about how do we determine what claims go into a token? How do I, like in your SailPoint example, I can see who has certain roles. I can do separation of duties based on that. I can, map what roles are accessing which applications and so on. How do I do that when tokens are used? Because I'm saying you can't answer. I'm basically saying you cannot answer that question, because there's no query that you can write against some policy instance that says, managers can see information in their region or in their department and so on. There's no generalized policy structure that is governing the issuance of these tokens. So that's a huge issue for me.
Right. Let me just respond to that really quickly. So the tokens convey information about people and workloads, and your policies are the same. You might have RBAC policies, and actually this gets back to what Atul was saying too, which is that the token itself is the input to the policy, not the policies. We have tons of policies. We could have RBAC policies, ABAC policies, NHI policies. There can be all sorts of policies but the token is the input to the policy.
Oh no,
so it can't be.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think there's issuance policies, and then there are execution or evaluation policies. So I want to be clear.
Yes,
I want to be clear. If I'm in a session with an application, I've logged in, I get some information in my access token. How did that come to be? That's before I even access some resource. So that's my question. What is the policy?
The IDP itself needs
right.
policies in order to know what content to
That's
issue.
Right. And today, those policies are just the configuration of that IDP. There's no policy language that I can query, because it's like, it's almost like a federation question. I'm the relying party, and the auditor asks me, okay, who can access this application? Well, you almost can't answer that, because it's anybody at, partner A who has a federation agreement with us. Anybody there that meets a certain list of requirements can access this relying party application. So it's the same thing here. I mean, anybody that has a valid token can access this resource. Okay, who can get this? Who can get a token that's configured in that way? That's the sort of governance question that auditors are asking, that resource owners are asking, and it's a difficult one to answer.
I agree with you 100% that the IDP itself needs to call policies. Because should you issue this client or this workload, this claim, or should you allow this client that's registering to ask for this scope? The IDP has a million policies it needs to determine, and those should be externalized. But actually, one way I've heard it described is that the token is the new PIP, the policy information point. Atul, maybe you could react to that. Is the token? Could you consider the token the PIP?
At a very fine-grained level, at the transaction level, yes. But I think going back to what you're talking about, whether token is the input to the policy, or the policy is the input to it. We're talking about very different things here, right? So when you're talking about the IDP policy, it's even before the access token has been minted, right? Or the ID token has been minted. And so, yes, in that sense, there is certain policy elements that come in before the higher level authorization or access token is being minted. Right now, there is another policy which is at the PDP level, which takes the token as the input and then decides, oh, for this principle, for this action, for this resource, and in this context, whether this action is permitted or not. And then you're minting another token, which is the transaction token, which is then you can think of as the PIP for the downstream processes for making their decision.
You're really pushing the transaction tokens here. Let me just push back on you a little bit and say, might I have more than one transaction token? I was talking with Eve yesterday at our meetup in Austin for South by, and I said, you could actually maybe profile UMA with transaction tokens. It's a token exchange that happens after authentication. But maybe I could have a number of transaction tokens, one that gives me the right to do business on behalf of my parents, another one that gives me access to medical information. Might I actually have a number to make an authorization decision? Perhaps I need a number of tokens, transaction tokens, access tokens, ID tokens, and especially multiple transaction tokens of varying degrees of granularity.
Yeah, I mean, totally. And transaction tokens are ephemeral, right? They're very, very, very short-lived, right? Few seconds, few minutes at the most, right? And so you would need many of them to do any particular job that you're trying to do. But, and again, to your point that, you would need different access token, you need an ID token, you need various other things to get the job done. That is absolutely true, right? It's not like one thing kind of overrides everything else here.
Jerry, last topic, and then we'll go to last thoughts. And we probably don't have time for this question, but thoughts on ITDR? There's so much data coming out. How can we better visualize this data and detect threats and respond to threats? And could token-based access control, would it help us, or be a non-issue, or where does it fit in this model?
Yeah, I'd rather turn this discussion to CAPE and shared signals. I don't know. I think of that as a more meaningful way to actually, do this, to do the response, to share the risk signals, because they could be coming from any system. So I think when I think of ITDR, I don't know. I just think of more of a CAPE-like situation, and I think the token-based model presents some challenges here, especially for longer-lived tokens. I think that's something that we have to be wary of. I know a tool you've mentioned several times, for transaction tokens specifically, that they're very, very short-lived. But I think that's an issue for replay or other attacks that we always have to be wary of. But also, if we discover some incident or risk signal, I mean, how do we revoke that token? How do we tell the downstream systems that this particular token is no longer valid? So I think those are some of the challenges in either approach there.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jerry, because I think CAPE and risk and SSF is finally based on token. They're security event tokens, right? They're JWTs, they're signed JWTs. But to your point about ITDR, Mike, in CAPE, we've added a couple of events that help ITDR, which is, the session presented and session created. I think two events, which can help you detect lateral movement, which is one of the key things that you need to do in ITDR, is to detect whether the same user is trying to, abnormally access a whole lot of services. And you can do that using tokens that are essentially CAPE events issued by each service saying, I'm seeing this user now. And when you collate all of that and you notice that, oh my God, this user is now sort of trying to access everything at the same time, you're able to shut it down. Right? So
yeah, I just want to qualify a little bit. So CAPE might be involved after we actually detect. So after we detect a threat, we might want to communicate that threat to other systems. But my question is more about how do we detect threats? Because right now, ITDR is very account-centric. We look at a user and we look at that user's behavior across as mostly login events or other transactions. But it might be interesting to have a more token-based view of the events in order to detect anomalies. So it's not just that this person is acting suspiciously, but this particular token is the primary key is the token instead of the user identifier. And that it might enable us to give a different view. Anyway, let's go to last thoughts. Atul, we're doing it alphabetical, so I'll give you the stage first. Last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like I have said multiple times in this, my opinion about using tokens for authorization is at the very fine-grained, ephemeral level. And, that's what transaction tokens represents. But it was a great discussion. Jerry, Mike, I love you both guys, and, it's great to talk to you. So thanks for having me.
Jerry, last
Yeah,
thoughts?
thanks, Mike, for hosting this. And Atul, always great to be in a conversation with you. I always learn something. I would close by highlighting some of the auth-gen work again. We're doing another interop demonstration in a couple of weeks at the Gartner Identity event in London. So if you're going to be in London for that, definitely check it out. I think there's some other CAPE work going on there as well. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks everyone for watching. Back to you, Mike.
So we're in honor of this being the first episode where we have returned alumni Identerati. We're doing the first Identerati pigeon release. That's why the window has been open. So we have a very special guest today.
Oh wow!
Special guest,
awesome.
And it's going out the window.
Whoa!
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So
Freedom.
I was hoping there wouldn't be too much noise from outside. So luckily the dog wasn't barking or anything. So with that, we will conclude this episode. Next week, as I mentioned previously, we have a meeting with iShare, or a live stream with iShare. And please join us next Tuesday. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Atul. And we'll see you next